Welcome to Full Disclosure, a podcast to provide legal information and updates to individuals, business owners and business advisors in South Australia. This podcast is brought to you by Mellor Olsson Lawyers, a full-service South Australian law firm. The information, opinions and recommendations presented in this podcast are for general information only and do not constitute legal advice in any way. Reliance on the information contained in this podcast is done so at your own risk. In today's episode, we're talking with Mellor Olsson partner Eva Bailey. Eva is a family lawyer. Welcome, Eva.
Thanks for having me, Lucy.
So, Eva, I've asked you along today. Obviously, as a family lawyer, you assist clients in a variety of parenting matters, including the custody and adoption of children and minors, I'm assuming, under the age of 18. What I wanted to ask you about today is something that we don't hear of that often, but it's the concept of adult adoption. Can you explain what that is, please?
Sure. Adult adoption is the process whereby there's an application to the court to legally recognise the relationship between an adult child and someone who has acted as a parent to them.
Is this a relatively new thing?
It is a new thing, Lucy. It was in 2016 that the South Australian Parliament changed the Adoption Act to allow adults to be adopted. Prior to that, adults couldn't be adopted in the state of South Australia. It was in 2018, December, that the Parliament put in place regulations that then enabled that process to actually take place.
So in what instances does adult adoption usually occur?
Look, people ask me that quite a lot. In fact, why would an adult want to be adopted? And the answer is that people want to recognise someone who has come into their life and supported them emotionally and financially, often as a parent, and who isn't in fact their biological parent. So that would often be in the case of a foster parent or in the case of a step parent.
And are you finding that because the legislation's changed, you've sort of got some retrospective parenting relationships that are being recognised as an adult adoption in your practice today?
Yes, I am finding that, Lucy, that people are wanting to recognise, and it might be somebody who's been in their life for 10 years or 20 years, but recognise somebody legally who has been a parent-like figure to them, especially where their biological parent hasn't been able to do that for them, and they want to recognise that and effectively thank that person, I guess, for being in that role for them.
Oh, it's really lovely. It's sort of giving me all the warm and fuzzies. So how does it work? How would one go about, do you seek to be adopted, or is it the adult, well, I suppose they're both adults, but is it the one that's acted as the parent that initiates the adoption?
It is the parent figure that needs to make the application to the youth court, and that is, even though this is involving adults and adult adoption, the jurisdiction is still the youth court because that's the court that deals with all adoptions under the Adoption Act. And it is the adult parental figure that needs to apply to the court and supply evidence to the court to support their application and show why they should be able to adopt this adult child in their life.
And do you have to prove that you've got an existing relationship with this person? And can I just ask Elon Musk to adopt me, for example, or do you have to actually be able to prove that there's been a parental relationship?
Unfortunately, Lucy, we can't all ask strange billionaires to adopt us. I have had that question before, but it's really to recognise that pre-existing relationship that someone has had with a parent-like figure before they turned 18. That's one of the requirements of the Act, because the intention is to enable those pre-existing relationships to be recognised, not ones that occur after you're 18.
Okay, and is there a time period, like could I be now as an adult in my 40s, but I'm recognising a parenting relationship that happened 30 years ago, or does it have to be in a shorter period of time?
As long as it's a parenting relationship that existed before you were 18, there's no time limit on when you can bring that application.
Oh, that's really interesting. So what happens in the process? You've decided that you're going to go down this application process and both parties are consenting, which we've figured out it's really important. How do you go about it? What has to happen in the first stages?
So you need to apply to the court and provide evidence to the court. There's some requirements that need to be met. At the end of the day, the adult person applying needs to be resident in South Australia. The Adoption Acts change state to state, and it is state-based legislation. So the applying parent does need to be living in South Australia, and the adoptee adult child needs to be coming to South Australia or being in this state for this process to occur.
Okay. So what happens in the situation that, because I can assume that this is a little bit simpler when there is a deceased biological parent, but what happens if there is a living biological parent? How do you go about adopting a child if there's a living biological parent?
So quite often there will be one biological parent who's been in the person's lives, and it's someone else who's come in to help look after them as a step parent, or it might be that it's a foster parent or parents. In any case, we need to have the proper and formal consent of the adult child, as well as the proper and formal consent of the biological parents. The court can make exemptions if obviously one of the biological parents, maybe they haven't been involved in the child's life, but they also don't want to give up their rights in terms of a parent to that child. The court can make exemptions in cases where it's appropriate in the circumstances. So you can imagine that it's difficult for the court. They don't treat it lightly, severing that relationship between a biological parent and a child, but at the same time, if you have an adult child who feels very strongly about being adopted by someone who's been like a parent to them, the court can make an exemption and often will do so.
How do they decide?
It's all about what's based on the child's best interests. That's what the paramount concern of the Adoption Act is about, and that is the reason the court will grant certain exemptions and allow adoptions to occur when it's appropriate in the circumstances.
So what changes legally,
Effectively, when an adult adoption occurs, the person is then legally the child of that parent and no longer a child of their former biological parent. This can have implications for estates and wills and inheritances, which are all things that we will discuss with our client and mention to the adult child at the time. Sometimes I have had people approach me to go through this process because they've got a complicated will set up and they want to make sure that this child, who's effectively been a child of theirs but not legally, is properly looked after in their will. It also can change a person's birth certificate. So when the adoption order is granted, the court will send it to births, deaths and marriages, and that will then affect the person having a different change on their birth certificate. The adult child who's being adopted can choose to keep all parents on their birth certificate, such that they've got their biological parents and their adopted parent or parents on there, or they can choose to have a biological parent removed and the adopted parent put in their place if that's what they choose to do.
We're obviously used to talking about biologically a male and a female, but does it need to be a male and a female on that birth certificate? Can you have a female biological parent and another female wanting to do that adult adoption and that be acknowledged on the birth certificate?
Look, I think you can, Lucy. I haven't had that specific instance where I've helped a client with that, although I have had some inquiries about it. And some years ago, the government in SA did put in a number of legislative changes to allow for equality and to allow for documents legally to be changed in that way. I understand that you can now have two mums or two dads named on a birth certificate. So I expect that you can have those applications through the youth court. I'm just not aware of one actually occurring at this stage. But I look forward to trying to help someone with that process if it does come up.
I can imagine that in some complex situations it could be quite cathartic to be able to remove a relationship that you don't have, a fond memory of. And
that's right, Lucy. I have had clients, unfortunately, where a biological parent has let them down and not been a part of their life, and they have really felt that absence. And then when someone has stepped in to take that place, it's really important for them to legally recognise that and to remove the biological parent who hasn't been there for them.
What's the process like? How would someone go about doing this? I'm assuming the best place to start would come and chat to someone like yourself?
Yes, usually, quite often it will be the adult child who contacts us for legal advice and assistance with the process, and it will be the applying parental figure that will need to actually make the application. So then we will speak to them as a client and make sure it's an application that they're wanting to make, and we'll help them with the process. Ultimately, it will take a couple of months and usually a couple of court hearings to have the application granted.
I'd imagine someone going through this process must really want the outcome, which I imagine in your line of work, working in family law, must be such a beautiful thing to be involved in. I guess it could be quite an emotional and rewarding journey to be a part of.
It really is quite rewarding, Lucie. As a family lawyer, I deal with a lot of people who are often in dispute, unfortunately, about care arrangements for their children and their property settlements and things like that. But in terms of adult adoption, it is really rewarding to see families come together and recognise a relationship that's pre-existing, a parent who has stepped in for a child and that child wanting to recognise that as an adult.
Oh, it really is such a lovely thing to be able to offer. I want to thank you so much for your time today, Eva. It's been really insightful and really interesting.
Thank you, Lucie. It's been a pleasure.
The information in this podcast is general in nature. For podcast terms and conditions, further information on Eva Bailey, family law or Mellor Olsson Lawyers, visit molawyers.com.au.